Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. It's generally accepted that we've been living in an age of populism, be it Brexit, Boris or Trump. Voters here in the UK and across the pond have vented their fury at conventional politics and politicians. Today, our guest argues that that period of history is drawing to a close. He is Peter Kellner, one of the UK's most renowned political commentators and the founder of the polling company YouGov. Hello and welcome, Peter.
Morning, Nicholas. Or afternoon.
Well, afternoon, indeed. Yeah, you're speaking to us here in London. We're at our home as normal on the Welsh-English border. And this is going to be a wide-ranging conversation. It's obviously a big topic, but we're going to focus on politics in the UK to start with, notably Brexit, but also we're going to talk about the pandemic and its impact on governments everywhere. But firstly, I'm going to ask a question that combines those two things, Brexit and the pandemic. So firstly, Peter, at the moment, what is the attitude of voters here in the UK towards Brexit? What are the opinion polls saying at the moment?
Nicholas, there's been quite an interesting change since the new year. The referendum for Brexit was 5 years ago. And over the first 4.5 years, there was a very, very slow but steady shift with more Leave voters having second thoughts to Remain voters. So by Christmas, or 4 months ago, a majority of people said we probably got it wrong. We shouldn't have left the EU. But since Christmas, that's gone into reverse. And today, when pollsters are asked, would you now vote to go back in or stay out, they showed much the same figures as we got in the referendum 5 years ago. So what's changed since Christmas? Well, one thing that's changed is that the transition phase is over. We're now into Brexit for real. But that's not been very good news. Problems over trade between the mainland Britain and Northern Ireland, people like fisheries not being able to export to Europe. But the other thing, which has captured the headlines much more, is the rollout of vaccines. And this, the EU appears to have messed up. In Britain, the rollout of vaccines has gone very well. And I think that is the big driver of what has happened in the last 3 months. And the reason why today we're back roughly where we were 5 years ago, with a narrow majority saying we're right to be out of the EU.
I wanted to ask that question because it does show you how much opinion on that particular topic can shift sort of back and forth. But you've also written in sort of greater detail about this. You talked about the red wall in the UK, the constituencies in the UK that used to vote firmly Labour, then voted for Brexit, and then also voted for Boris Johnson's Conservatives. And it's really due to their so-called red wall that his large victory in the last elections put down to that. So can you, and I think looking at this red wall helps us a bit more to understand what was going on with Brexit. So what was happening in those constituencies and how does it explain some of the shifts here in the last decade?
Well, let me start by pulling back, Nicholas, because if you take the long run, the last 20, 30, 40 years ago, what's been happening in Britain is actually very similar to what's been happening in the United States. So when we talk about the red wall seats, we're talking about seats mainly in the middle of England, the Midlands and the north of England, which were the heart of British industry in the 20th century, where you had the factories, the coal mines, the shipyards, the steelworks, where cars were made, where the great majority of people in work in those areas had manual jobs, often quite skilled, reasonably well paid. And those industries have gone. And if you look at America, much the same thing has happened in the so-called Rust Belt, from Pennsylvania up to the Midwest, Wisconsin, Michigan, and so on. And what has happened is that just as those areas in Britain were traditionally solid Labour areas, the Rust Belt in the United States was traditionally Democrat. And as those areas have changed, as the economics have changed, as the industries have gone, as the well-paid manual jobs have gone, support for Labour has weakened in Britain and support for the Democrats has weakened in the United States. So we saw the culmination of that in the Donald Trump victory 4.5 years ago. Now, add Brexit into the mix, and this is quite curious, because the great majority of these people who've switched from Labour to Conservatives are in favour of Brexit, and that's an important part of the mix. But all the evidence, when you look at it closely, shows that Brexit is more the symptom than the cause of what's going on. For many people in these areas, they've got increasingly disillusioned with what they call the metropolitan elite, which feels it has ignored them. And to them, the metropolitan elite loved the EU. So the European Union has been found, if you like, guilty by association, rather than because anything it's specifically done. But it has crystallized these views quite strongly. So although Brexit is the symptom rather than the cause of the troubles in these areas, it is nevertheless strongly associated with them in the minds of voters in those areas.
So if you like, David Cameron's referendum gave them the opportunity to vent their frustration.
That's right. And when the campaign 5 years ago was underway, it must be said the Leave campaign, the pro-Brexit campaign, was infinitely more effective than the Remain campaign in exploiting these long-term fears.
Okay, on another recent article, you wrote about, you used the following phrase. You said, for Britain, the war will soon be over. What did you mean by this?
Yeah, I grew up in the post-war era. I was born, 18 months after the end of the Second World War. It shows how old I am. And I grew up in an era where Britain defined itself by the Second World War. We were the country that stood alone from the fall of France through to the German invasion of Russia a year later, 1940-41. And there was a degree of pride in what Britain had done. But because Britain lived in its recent past, it never really came to terms with its role in the post-war world. And we saw this in the debate which went on about whether Britain should join, first of all, the coal and steel community, the forerunner to the common market, which was in itself a forerunner to the European Union. That progression through the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s towards Europe coming together. Britain eventually joined in the early 70s, but it was thought of as a purely sort of commercial arrangement. It didn't really, it rather sidestepped the issue of where Britain's place in the modern world was. And I think what Brexit is doing is forcing us to have what is a rather scrappy but intense national debate about where Britain is in the world. And over the next 3, 4, 5 years, I think one of two things will happen. Either we'll settle down and live with Brexit and be comfortable with it, or most of us will be comfortable with it, in which case I think we'll say we'll have drawn a line under that episode of Britain's relationship with Europe, which began with the Second World War, or we'll say, no, this is a mess. You know, Britain is a European power. We've got to work much more closely with other European countries, and therefore become a properly, psychologically, if you like, a properly committed European country. It's that psychological location that we've never really properly settled since 1945.
The vision of Britain, as I see it today, is very much framed by the likes of, key Eurosceptics like Enoch Powell, also my stepfather, John Biffin. These people were committed, Eurosceptics, obviously, but also committed unionists. And this is the thing that I find fascinating, is that they could not see how that their Euroscepticism might actually lead to the dismembering of the union. Is that something that you would agree with?
Yes, and it's really curious because if you go back to when Enoch Powell and John Biffin, your father and your stepfather, were active in politics in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, they were right to see unionism within Britain and Euroscepticism in relation to the rest of the continent as not just compatible, but pretty well parallel, almost identical objectives. And so the Northern Ireland political establishment was pro-London and anti-Brussels. Scotland, the Scottish nationalists 40 years ago, they were anti-Europe as well. Well, in both Northern Ireland and Scotland, that's radically changed, because although the unionist parties in Northern Ireland are strongly for the union, hence the name unionist, they are now in a power sharing agreement. We've had the Good Friday Agreement, and the Good Friday Agreement had as part of its basis that both Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic were part of the European Union. And that made, in practical terms, a big difference. It made the Good Friday Agreement possible because it meant there could be a completely open border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. And of course, the Irish Republic was and remains in the EU. So the border within the island of Ireland is the one land border between Britain now and the EU. And the SNP are now strongly pro-European, and what they're saying, they want a referendum, they want an independent Scotland, which will then, they hope, rejoin the EU. So we've got lots of trouble now implementing Brexit in relation to Northern Ireland, because it seems to undo a key part of the Good Friday Agreement. And we've got a real possibility of another referendum in Scotland, which might produce independence. So unlike 40 years ago, there is a conflict between unionism and Euroscepticism, where 40 years ago they were on the same side.
It's absolutely fascinating. So you're seeing this sort of huge period of uncertainty now, both Brexit, obviously provoking part of it, and devolution is obviously the thing that people like Powell and John Biffin would not be aware of those risks some time ago. At the same time, you seem to be more confident of possibly a less populist era of politics coming back. And I wanted to talk a bit more about that. But first of all, just in terms of the rhetoric between the European Union and the UK, what's going on at the moment?
Well, something odd has happened. It's in the last 5 or 6 weeks. And the immediate aftermath of the agreement, which was signed, I think, on Christmas Eve, so just 4 months ago, which seemed to have a full agreement between Britain and the EU about how things would progress on trade and so on the rules of Britain's relationship with the EU. That became a bit untidy in the new year when the new agreement came into force. A lot of practical difficulties came up, and there were sort of arguments between London and Brussels as to who was to blame for the reason that the fishing industry couldn't export fish to Europe, or what the rules were on regulating trade between the British mainland and Northern Ireland, what was going to happen to lawyers, to bankers who had difficulty working with Europe, and so on. And then you had this intense, unseemly row over vaccines, where the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, unwisely said she would block supplies of vaccines crossing from the EU into Britain. And this provoked an instant reaction. And within 2 hours, and just 2 hours later, she withdrew that. But the trouble is that it left a nasty taste in the mouth in London, and you got into a pretty violent argument. So we had these 3 battles going on in sort of January, February, early March, very public battles over the trade in vaccines, over the rules governing the so-called Northern Ireland Protocol, how you regulated trade between mainland Britain and Northern Ireland, given that Northern Ireland was still part of the European arrangements for trade. And finally, what was going to happen on financial services. And then almost suddenly, both sides put their megaphones down. And we got into where we now are, 3 sets of negotiations going on in private to try and resolve them. So it's clear to me that both sides have decided they do want to get these things sorted out, and it's better to sort them out without having a megaphone in your hand and to do it behind closed doors. Now, that said, they are all tricky issues, and I don't know whether they will be solved. I'll give you one tiny example, well, not tiny, one specific example, which is what the Northern Ireland government and business are complaining about is that under the agreement, all animals, foodstuffs, plants, anything sort of currently or recently living has to be checked very carefully, and it's sold from mainland England or Wales or Scotland into Northern Ireland, so that it doesn't, so that within Northern Ireland it doesn't break European rules, right? And these tests are quite onerous and expensive and slow. Now, there's a very simple way to solve this, which is that Britain could say, we will, as we were when we were in the EU, we will apply Europe, what are called a photosanitary rule, SPSS. We will apply European rules to the trade in current and recently living things. And if Britain did that, and so that it would enforce it, that would dispose of almost all of the problems with the Northern Ireland Protocol. But it would mean Britain signing up to obey rules it no longer has any role in designing. So it would be handing power back to the EU to decide how a part of British commerce operates. And part of the point for the Brexiters in Britain was that we would not be subject to European rules, we would design our own. So here is the problem which they're trying to grapple with. Does Britain say, does it have British rules and then blockages between Britain and Northern Ireland, or does it have European rules and no blockage? Can they find a compromise between those positions? I don't know. What I'm saying is it's possible, but it'll be difficult.
So in a way, you've had this enormous rupture. That was a sort of the process of leaving the European Union and the fall of Theresa May's government, Boris Johnson's government being elected, and then finally an agreement. That's the sort of dramatic breakup, if you like. And now what you have is this sort of difficult step-by-step working out where we actually stand with Europe. And you're talking about a possible sort of rapprochement over a longer period of time. You're not talking about going back in any way, but this is what you talk about when you talk about for Britain, the war is over and trying to work out where it stands with the rest of Europe.
Yeah, because that's exactly right. Because almost all of these specific disputes in the end come down to what is Britain's relationship with Europe when it finally settles down, which it hasn't yet. We've left the EU, but as these current disputes show, there's a lot of I's still to be dotted, a lot of T's still to be crossed. And that process will, I think, it'll either conclude in a stable and happy relationship, or it won't. And one way or the other, we will then, I think, come to a clear view as a country. As I say, it's a psychological as much as an economic or political decision as to what relationship we want to have with the rest of the continent. Okay,
we've spoken about lots of sort of different strands here. I mean, Brexit is the key thing here. We've talked about there's nationalism involved, whether it's English nationalism, Scots nationalism. There's the impact on the Union in Northern Ireland. So there are lots and lots of things going on here. And in the midst of all of this comes the pandemic, and you have a huge amount of public spending, an enormous amount of debt being built up. And this obviously is going to have an impact on all of this. How do you think the pandemic is going to shape the politics of the immediate future? And I'm obviously talking about the UK, but then more broadly when we look at other governments like the US or elsewhere.
We're at one of those stages, Nicholas, where there is a fundamental script about the future which is yet to be written. If I may, again, and I try not to do it too often, go back to the Second World War. One of my treasured possessions is a copy of a magazine. There used to be a popular progressive, not very left-wing magazine called Picture Post. And in January 1941, at the height of the Blitz, Britain Alone, its survival in doubt, it produced a whole issue called A Plan for Britain. And it said, what are we fighting this war for? And it set out what actually became pretty well the complete post-war agenda. for education, for the health service, for pensions, for unemployment insurance, for new towns. I mean, it was a quite extraordinarily prescient publication, which struck a huge chord. And I think we're at the stage now where people are asking the question, what sort of country do we want to emerge from this pandemic? And we're groping around in the dark for the answers. So I'm fairly confident in saying that in 10 or 20 years' time, we will look upon the pandemic as a point where the direction of British politics and British society changed, possibly fundamentally. But I'm not yet quite sure what that new direction will be. I think the one thing that is becoming clear in Britain, and again in other countries, including the United States, if one looks at what Joe Biden is doing, I think we've probably seen the end of the era of liberal economies in the sense of the state keeping out of the way and trying to allow the private sector to do as much as possible. There is an increasing feeling, which I think the pandemic hasn't caused but has crystallized, for saying, actually, we do need a bit less private sector, a bit more government. Not necessarily the government owning lots of things as it used to, but regulating, directing, making sure that the private sector acts properly and in the national interest. So that may be one of the ways in which society will change.
And obviously, I mean, we're thinking about the National Health Service in the UK. It's often referred to as the only sort of real national religion. It's something everyone sort of can't question. You have to believe in it. But I presume that there are conversations in the States about that too.
Yeah, I mean, plainly in the United States, where you don't have sort of socialized medicine at all. Bernie Sanders called for it, but he didn't get nominated either in 2017 or this time. But equally plainly, one of the things that Joe Biden has wanted to do is build on Obamacare, because one of the big problems, obviously for decades in the American system, as it was 60 or 100 years ago across Europe, was the people who were too poor to be able to afford either to insure or pay for medical treatment. And Obamacare brought something like 20 million people, I think, into some form of insurance system, but it still leaves a lot of people out. And Joe Biden wants to expand that. But if you look at his recent plans for infrastructure, not just the physical stuff, roads, bridges, railways, and so on, but if you like, the soft infrastructure, education and talent and technology and things like that. I think increasingly there's a role for government, and also you're getting a big public demand, which again predated the pandemic, but I think have been enhanced. All the big multinational technology companies that manage to arrange their fares so they pay very little tax anywhere in the world. So I think there is now much more like when I was growing up or as a young adult, people looked to government to tackle these problems, where in my sort of middle adult years, government was seen much more broadly as the problem rather than the solution. It is now seen as the solution more than the problem.
I'd love to start taking questions, please, everyone. So if you can just, in the bottom right-hand side of your screen, if you can put your questions in the Q&A box. The Q&A box may be elsewhere on your computer, and then we can start putting those questions to Peter. The sort of powerhouse of British politics at the moment is the right wing of the Conservative Party. The Republicans have been given a bloody nose, but the libertarian element within both the Conservatives here and the Republicans are not going to be happy, surely, with this commitment to public spending and big projects, or are they?
Very interesting questions, and I'm not sure the politics in Britain and America will play out in quite the same way. Let me first of all say about America that the actions of Republican presidents, going right back to Ronald Reagan and then George Bush Sr., then George Bush Jr. and Trump, they've talked about smaller government, but they've delivered they haven't delivered smaller government. So there is a gap in America between rhetoric and reality. And one's beginning to see now that although the Republicans in Congress are pretty well unanimous in opposing Joe Biden's, first of all, the pandemic relief, the $1.9 trillion he doled out a few weeks ago, and now his infrastructure plan. When you get to state level, you're getting Republican governors actually thinking, well, if it's out there, I want a slice of this. So there is a slight gap between the Republicans nationally and at least some Republicans at state level. In Britain, there is a slice of the Tory right which does believe very much in free market. The true believers in the old Thatcherite faith from the 1980s. But I don't think there are enough of them to overturn a government that would rather maintain the votes they gain, because after all, the votes on which they based their comfortable majority, as we discussed earlier, the former Labour voters in the Midlands and North, these are not right-wing free market voters. These are people who do want government to improve their lives, whether it's in terms of pensions or welfare payments or a better health service or better funded schools or better roads and rail links. These are people who want government spending. So I think the problem is a theoretical problem in terms of the Conservative right more than a practical political problem.
So I think I'm going to get you to repeat your main sort of tenet of your argument again, and then about this return to populism. So we're seeing a shift, if you can think of a pendulum, a shift away from a Thatcherite free market economics that we were having a conversation earlier. This was something that Tony Blair had accepted in the 1990s, that the argument had been won by the free marketeers. And now you're saying that voters in general have an expectation that the government should be more dirigiste.
Yeah, dirigism is put it strongly, and that is certainly true of some voters. I think I don't think that the voters who matter, who decide elections, I'm not sure that many of them have a fully thought through, as it were, ideologically coherent view about the role of the state versus the role of the market. What they have a view about is their local school, their local hospital, their local town centre. What happens to them if they lose a job and they need unemployment benefit for a while? What their pension will be when they retire? And so when they're asked, would you like to see the railways, for example, remain in private hands or back under state control? They say no, we'd actually like them under state control, because they don't see that as I don't like supermarkets, whether you have a choice. I don't think anybody saying supermarkets should be run by the state, even though food is even more important to life than train journeys. But so I think what you've got is a sort of a pragmatic wish, which in practice amounts to return to these sort of centrist politics, which in the 50s and 60s, where both Labour and the Conservatives in those days in practice shared a view about a mixed economy in which there was a fair amount of state involvement and a lot of private, big role for the private sector. And they would disagree a bit on the line between the two, but not on the need for both to be fundamentally big. So if you like, there is what amounts to a wish to reverse at least some of the Thatcherite changes of the 80s and 90s. Not all of them, but some of them.
Okay, we've got lots of questions coming in now, so I'm going to take them. I'm not going to take them in the order they've been asked, because I'm going to take them in the order that fits in with the conversation. So I'm going to take Diane Cook first. So could you go ahead with your question, Diane? Just say where you are as well.
Yes, I'm in the UK, and I was interested in your comment about psychological adjustment, because it seems to me that, particularly talking to people in the pandemic, that there's an awful lot of people are thinking in very different ways, maybe somewhat inchoate, and it's not a philosophy yet. But I just wonder, do you see the established parties responding to this? How do you see them responding to it? Or do you see that maybe they will be captured by an entirely new group of people, perhaps, younger people who have got not just the consequences of the pandemic, which has thrown up an awful lot of issues. But
Diane, are you referring mainly to the UK? Because I guess it sort of depends upon the sort of voting systems as to whether that's possible in different countries. So you're referring specifically to sort of England, or where were you thinking of?
Well, I was thinking of the UK, because the UK Parliament is actually still voted on as a single entity. So not the devolved parts of the UK, but the UK.
Diane, it's a great question. And we're going to spend the whole hour discussing the prospects for each of the parties in turn. So let me give you a brief response. The Conservatives, I think, as historically they've done, they've adjusted rapidly and flexibly. The Conservative Party, it's not an accident that the Conservative Party has been dominated British politics for most of the last 190 years, and it is by far the longest successful continuous political party in the world. And it's because when things need change, it changes. The Labour Party is a bit more of a problem. The Labour Party has always been a coalition between, if you like, workers and intellectuals, between the concerns of people on low and average incomes and the liberal views, which are now regarded as the metropolitan elite. But it was a coalition that worked. And a part of the problem now is the coalition isn't working as well. And one of the things that Brexit has brought to a head, something which was evolving anyway, was an increasing gap between the outlook of the liberals, small L liberals in the Labour Party, and the, if you like, the workers in the Labour Party. And I think the Labour Party has a real challenge. It can only win elections under our system if it can combine those two different forces. If it goes purely for one rather than the other, it cannot win an election. But can it recreate that coalition effectively? I don't know. Let me make one other brief point. That I think that we may see this incidentally in the elections on May the 6th. It's possible that we'll see the slipping down of the Liberal Democrat vote and the growth in the Green vote. And if you suddenly look around Europe, I mean, Germany is an obvious example. One of the things we may see in a number of countries in the next few years is the rise of the Greens as a major and sometimes principal left of centre force in a number of countries. And I'm not predicting this, I'm not saying it's likely, but I think there's a real possibility that 10 years from now, the Greens will have taken over from the Liberal Democrats as their third force in UK-wide politics.
And not least of all in Scotland, where they could have the key to the Parliament there. But Alex Salmond is doing his best to confuse that. We can come back to that in a second. David Scott, you've got a question about the future of Europe. So go ahead, David.
Yeah, I mean, fascinating talk, Peter, and I think you're very brave to take all these things on. I'm on HS2, on the HS2 line, so there are issues about the future of railways and so on. But my particular point is about the future of the EU itself, because what seems to me to have emerged, and the pandemic has driven this quite fast in that direction, is the discontent and the difficulties of maintaining a group of 27 people running on the same sort of policies. How do you see it?
Peter, it would seem to be that if you read articles in the article or Standpoint and magazines like that, that the breakup of Europe is inevitable and the end of the euro is inevitable, and that this decline, it's the fact that we got out is a jolly good thing.
Right, well, I would start by saying, I think you go back to the Treaty of Rome, which is 64 years ago, and I'm pretty sure in every single one of those 64 years, you could find serious commentators saying it won't last. it doesn't work. It's inevitably going to break up. And it hasn't happened. And around 10 years ago, so forgive me name dropping, but when I studied economics in the 60s, my supervision partner was Mervyn King, who went on to become governor of the Bank of England. And I remember over dinner, Mervyn saying to me 10, 11 years ago, during the Greek crisis, the euro won't survive, or it'll only survive if Greece leaves the euro. It can't survive with Greece in the euro, because the only way Greece can survive in the euro is if Germany bails it out with billions of euros a year for the next 20 years, and the Germans won't put up with that. Well, Greece is still in the euro. The Germans have been actually bailing it out year by year. The German public isn't that happy about it, but Angela Merkel has been, since my conversation with Mervyn King, I think Angela Merkel has been re-elected as Chancellor at least twice, possibly 3 times. The EU has a track record of sort of defying economic logic. I mean, the Eurozone is plainly not what economists call a perfect currency zone. There isn't enough political power behind the Eurozone, but it carries on and it has met each crisis and tackled them. So all I would say is the historic record is that Europe somehow manages to, by pushing and shoving and squinting and doing compromises, it gets through all of these difficulties. And I think the reason is that there is still profoundly on the continent, it's one of the reasons why it's different from Britain, is there is still, there are the scars of the devastation of the Second World War for what, 10 or a dozen countries having been part of the Soviet bloc, across Southern Europe, post-war memories of having been under fascist rule in Spain, Portugal, and for a while, Greece. So the idea of a Europe that banishes any repetition of any of these horrors is incredibly powerful still, in a way that Britain, having not experienced any of these things, it wasn't occupied in the Second World War, it was never a Soviet colony, it was never a fascist state. You know, our record and our psychology is that bit different. So David, if you're asking me for an economist's answer, I'd agree with you, it shouldn't work. But when I look at the history and I look at the psychology, and therefore the politics of Europe, there is too much invested in the survival of the European project for anybody to allow it to come seriously unstuck.
Yeah, I think Sweden's possibly the only exception to the rule. Every country in Europe has either been involved in genocide, had dictatorship, or been occupied by another force. And those are all very compelling reasons to remain in a bloc that doesn't have another war. And that's what's left us out.
I mean, let me just say, Nicholas, is that, you know, whether in 30 or 40 years' time, when, you know, when we're sort of 4 generations rather than 2 generations away from the Second World War, whether that'll still be the same, I don't know. But for the moment, I think that those forces remain powerful. Okay, I'm going to chop and change again and come around to another question. We've got Sue G. Sue, you're there. Just say where you are and go ahead with your question.
Sure, thank you, Peter. That's fascinating. I'm in the U.S. and I'm curious about public opinion regarding this really bipartisan divide in both the Senate and the House that we're looking at right now here. I'm particularly interested whether you see younger voters who might have a different opinion or might be pushing towards a different, maybe a Green Party, or maybe a different kind of political force to create change. Because it seems like we're really kind of stuck, and if it's not for the Senate majority or House majority we currently have, I'm not sure that the Democrats will survive in the next election. Again, fascinating question. I mean, the one thing that America and Britain have in common is a majoritarian
sort of locally based way of choosing representatives at either state or national level. And the majoritarian system makes it really hard, has very high barriers to entry. So, you've had Ralph Nader in the States, you've got a Green Party in Britain. And in Britain, it's slightly more chance of breaking through. But of course, where the Green parties are much more successful, as in Germany, for example, is where you have proportional election systems, which allow, even encourage small parties with 5, 10, 15, 20% support to have a real impact. And that's not really the case in either Britain or the States. But I feel, right, both in Britain and the States, at least one party in both countries, arguably both main parties in both countries, is having difficulty adjusting to the worlds in which they find themselves. Now, if we had proportional systems, I'd be much happier to, put a few dollars on a bet on the Democratic Party declining massively over the next 5 years. But we don't have a proportional system, and therefore, I suspect, I can't see the Greens or anybody else coming along and replacing the Democratic Party from the centre or centre-left, however you wish to define it. In Britain and America, because we have essentially two-party systems, when one party has simply got it wrong over a period of time, it might take them 10 years or 15 years, they've sorted themselves out. The Labour Party in Britain was right out of it in the 1980s, but clawed its way back and won a huge victory in 1997. The Republicans, the Republicans were out of it in the Roosevelt era, and in the end came to terms, as the Conservative Party did in Britain, with the new post-Second World War world of a bigger state and social reforms. One can go through, I won't go through the histories of both countries, but in both countries, both parties, when they got it badly wrong, instead of being replaced by another party, as might happen in a proportional system, they've slowly but eventually clawed their way back to relevance and electoral success.
I'm going to take two questions now back to back. So first, Hilary Matthews, and then Philip Godfrey. So Hilary Matthews first, and then we'll take Philip's question straight off the back of that. So Hilary. Are you there, Hilary? Go ahead, Hilary. Go on. There you go. We can hear you now. Go on. Go ahead, Hilary. Okay, I think we've got a problem with your microphone. I'm going to ask your question for you then. Is there any real chance that the huge multinationals, Google, Amazon, Facebook, etc., will ever have to pay realistic taxes in either of the countries in which they operate? It's talked about so much, but nothing ever changes. What's public opinion on this issue? And might it put prices up? So that's Hilary's question. And then we'll take one from Philip Godfrey. Go ahead, Philip.
Yeah, Peter, thank you. Can you hear me, Nicholas?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, Peter, fascinating talk. Going to the core of your sort of thesis that this gravitational pull back from sort of a market-dominated social and political economy back to more of an involvement with the state, and the way that the right and left wings have accommodated this, is there not an argument to be said that the reason that populism will decline is because we are borrowing our way out of the very structural issues that lead to populism in the first place? So if you do believe in secular stagnation, and if you do believe that we are building up massive debt for the future, does that debt and the kindness of strangers that it relies upon eventually lead to renewed populism?
Shall I quickly take Hilary's question first?
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why I personally think Britain made a historic mistake to leave the European Union was that we will sort out multinationals and their taxation when and only if and when the United States and the European Union get together and agree a common policy. Because any major multinational company is not going to be successful unless it has access to the European and North American markets. So if the United States and European Union can get together and agree a common strategy for tax, then I think we can sort out the multinational tax problem. If not, we won't. I doubt, I know Joe Biden is trying to do it on his own. I'm not sure that will work, but the EU and US together could make it happen. Now that, Philip, your question about populism. And the first thing I say is populism never completely goes away. You for heaven's sake, go back to the fascists and Nazis in the 20s and 30s, or in Britain, the brief flowering of Oswald Mosley's fascist group. He never broke through, but he had lots of followers for a while. And you can look, populists in the United States, Huey Long and so on, through history. So they never completely go away, but they seem to sort of rise and fall in cycles. And one of the patterns is that when they seem to be doing well, then one or both of two things happens. One is they, in some countries, do sufficiently well that they are some part of the government, members of a coalition or whatever. And whenever they're in or near government, as has happened, for example, in the Netherlands, in Italy, in Finland, in Sweden, as soon as they get that far, people, and they have to accept some degree of responsibility, they lose support. Either because some people think they've compromised too far, or because they're seen naturally not to be very good at running things. They're very good at moaning about things, but not at running things. So, and again, in Britain, when we had the British National Party, an extreme right-wing group, 15, 20 years ago, it started winning seats in local councils, and very few were re-elected after their first election, because when they were actually councillors tackling people's own actual problems, they weren't any good at it. And people saw through them. Don't want you in charge of anything. So there's that. But the other thing is what you said, is that the context in which they operate changes utterly. And clearly, one of the consequences of the pandemic, perhaps this is a bit I missed out on my answer to Nicholas's earlier question, is that suddenly we're all uber Keynesians, in terms of deficit financing. And what I don't, again, one thing I don't know is whether in 20 years' time, we'll have a new paradigm, or even 10 years' time, a new paradigm around government deficits of the Keynesian type, because we find that we can actually live with quite big both debts and deficits without inflation taking off or the society breaking down, in which case governments will have a lot more freedom of maneuver than they thought they'd had for the last 30, 40 years. Or, as I'm now reading in the States, there are some people saying that inflation might well take off, and Joe Biden's reflationary policies will come badly unstuck. Well, it'll be interesting to see over the next 2 or 3 years whether inflation does take off in a big way. And I don't mean going up from 1% to 3%. I mean going up to 6, 7, 10%. If inflation really takes off, that'll set us in one direction for the medium-term future. If actually the American economy thrives, unemployment falls, inflation rises a bit, but not that much, interest rates stay historically fairly low, then we are in a new paradigm.
Philip, let me just come back to you on that. Does that sort of answer your question? What were you thinking about?
Yes, I mean, I take that point. There is a lot of chat about the new paradigm. I find myself, reading the papers and so having to suspend my disbelief with a lot of modern economic policy, because it feels as if it's defying the laws of economics, in that with the quantitative easing and with the sort of increasing interest in things like modern monetary theory, economists are scratching their heads, because they are asking themselves the question that you pose, Peter: is this actually challenging orthodoxy and doing so permanently? I'm slightly suspicious that we are talking ourselves into that position, and that, as to quote Mark Carney, we are relying on the kindness of strangers, and that eventually, to be crude, if the money runs out, then a lot of the issues that are gravitating, as they're pulling the political parties to the centre, and a renewed contract between state and market might be challenged. That's really all, and I have not got a clue what the answer is to that.
No, I think you're right. I think we're all groping around, wondering what's going to happen. I mean, one of the things we do know is that a number of countries, recently about South Africa, they're unable to do nearly as much as say, Britain or the United States in inflating the South African economy in response to the pandemic, because the money markets won't lend it the money at those interest rates. So they're rather stuck. But I think, what that demonstrates is that, where I think we're at is, I think there's now a general acceptance that the idea that you should borrow only to invest over the cycle is probably too restrictive a long-term strategy. There is a bit more room to borrow, to build up a debt, as long as it doesn't grow over the long term faster than the economy itself. So the debt as a proportion of the economy stays within bounds. That there's probably some room to build up deficits and debt. But plainly, there comes a point which, if you go too far, inflation takes off, the money markets revolt, interest rates climb, and governments are stuffed. The question is, where between those two pillars, and you want to find the right course between those two pillars, where exactly is the happy medium? I don't think we know, but I think we're going to find out over the next 3 or 4 years.
Peter, would you accept that democratic politicians of most colours are always seduced by the idea of spending their grandchildren's money, and that we have had historically low interest rates? I mean, this is a phenomenon that we don't need to speculate on. They are at a historic level in terms of how low they are. That surely has to factor into our thinking about government's ability to steer this middle course and to do the investments in infrastructure and so on and so forth. If they go up from 0.1% to 1%, it's significant, even though it seems like a small number.
Yeah, I agree with your description of the incentives of politicians. They do think short term, and this is incidentally applies both to to spending for short-term electoral gain, but also in Britain, a chronic indecision to take long-term infrastructure decisions, because you take HS2 or you take Terminal 3 at Heathrow or whatever, where you get a lot of the pain and resistance now, and the benefits, if they come, long after the current round of politicians have left politics. Where I disagree is this, where you said about burdening our grandchildren, because actually and this is where I think we need to go back to what Keynes wrote, because I think he demonstrated persuasively that that is not the right way to look at it, because if we build up debt, there are people who own that debt. Most of the owners of that debt, of British debt, are British people. It rearranges the financial assets of the British economy. It doesn't destroy anything. And the ideal thing is a bit like a company borrowing to expand. If it borrows and then uses the money wisely, then it will the growth of the company and of its profits should more than cover servicing the debt. So a company borrowing to invest successfully isn't burdening that company's shareholders from 30 years from now. It's benefiting the shareholders from 30 years ago. And I think the same is true of government. That government borrowing that helps to produce a healthier economy down the track will have no difficulty financing that deficit. Governments that borrow, and famously, you look at Venezuela or Zimbabwe or Germany in 1923, there are obvious examples around the world of governments just printing money just to hand out. Well, that's plainly mad, self-defeating, and in the end, intensely destructive. But that's not what we're talking about. The question is whether you look at what Joe Biden's proposing or what might happen in Britain or any other advanced country, is whether what it is doing is helping to produce a healthy economy 5, 10, 20 years from now, which will have no problem in servicing that debt.
I'd love to get some questions in from Australia. We've got, I can pick on some names, but I won't. You know who you are down under, so please, because you always have got a different and interesting perspective. So let's just get 1 or 2 questions from there. Sheila de Belague, you've got a question that fits in nicely here. Go ahead, Sheila.
I wanted to ask for a bit more on populism in Europe. I think, Peter, you've already dealt with that in a way, but what about the countries in which populist leaders have gone beyond the fringe, not just on the fringes of power, but actually hold it, like Poland and Hungary? Someone like Marine Le Pen in France. Do you see, can you foretell the end of populism in those countries?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And had I given a much longer answer, I hope I would have covered them. I think Poland and Hungary, and possibly in the near future, some other of the East European countries, I think there's still the overhang of the communist era. And that, as it were, complicates psychology in a number of ways. Firstly, their democratic DNA is far weaker and more recent than that of Western Europe, let alone Britain. It's weaker even than Spain, Portugal, and Greece, because they got rid of their fascists in the mid-70s, where it wasn't until 1990 that Eastern Europe escaped Soviet rule. So I'm not excusing it. I think what's happening is absolutely deplorable, but I think there are specific issues in Eastern Europe which don't quite translate across to, say, Western Europe or North America, or for that matter, countries like Japan or Australia or democracies around the world. France is a really interesting case, and I mean interesting in not necessarily in a good way, because the recent polls have shown Macron ahead of Marine Le Pen, but not by very much. I think the last polls I looked at, they were around 4 to 6 points. It was around 52, 53% Macron, 47, 48 to Marine Le Pen in the runoff. And on those figures, it is clearly possible that Marine Le Pen will be elected president. Let me say a couple of things. The first is that she has only got to that position by ditching quite a lot of the radical right-wing populism. I mean, I'm not, I think it would be terrible if she were elected. I think it would be awful for France. I think it would be awful for Europe. But she's not a Mussolini or a Hitler, or a Greek colonel or a Franco. I think France and Europe will go through a painful period, but I wouldn't be surprised if in the end it isn't quite as catastrophic, and it won't be great, but I don't think it'll be that catastrophic as a result. But my point is that she will win in large measure because she has broadened her electoral base way beyond the 20% first round vote she got last time, the 34% I think she got in the runoff. She's broadened that base by moving somewhat towards the mainstream. But the other point I make about France, so as I and others have done, France, and one can speculate out the reasons, is a fundamentally more turbulent society politically, and seems always to have been so. It's as if the folk memory of the 1789 revolution still plays a part in the French psyche. So when you get big strikes or the farmers complaining, you get much more sort of technicolor protests. Back in 1968, when I was a student, revolts across Europe, but they were much greater in Paris than anywhere else.
You've always shadows written protests to the barricades.
Yeah. So there is still a sort of you know, oh, barricades citoyennes, or I don't know what French is for barricades, but you know what I mean. You know, that is part of the French makeup, and there's a more fundamental distrust in France of politicians than in any other major Western democracy, as far as I'm aware, and that's probably partly why Marine Le Pen, you know, might be in with a shout.
Peter, I don't know if you've got more time, but I'm going to ask you one more question, but we've got some questions coming from Australia, so maybe you might be able to fit them in a second. But let's go to Helen Bessemer-Clark. I love your question, Helen, so go ahead with it.
Peter, I'm even older than you are, so I totally understand that when our generation is gone, the war will also be gone. My other question, and also you point out that the Red Wall, it seems to me, this is very glib, that the Red Wall have become the old Tories and the metropolitan elite are now the middle class socialists. And my concern, and it's a beef I have, is this matter of no platforming and the way that we're not allowed to debate some unattractive questions, but we have to follow the, it's a silly statement, but the wokery feeling. Do you think there's a pendulum that will bring us back to the center?
Yeah, what's your opinion of wokery, Peter?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I mean, my instinct is to be violently against you know, stopping anybody within reason perform anywhere. I mean, subject to the, you know, the laws of the land on, you know, racial incitement and so on. To be honest, I think wokery is a target that the right has magnified to fight its own battles. You know, I'm not, you know, I think there are a lot of daft people on the left, as there are a lot of daft people on the right, but I don't think their impact or effect is nearly as great as the right says. And so I think there's a, you know, and incidentally, there's a sort of mirror image here. In the 1970s, I thought the anti-Nazi League got it all wrong because it actually built up the National Front. When, you know, I would have ignored the National Front. You know, there's a temptation on both sides to magnify their enemy in order to justify the vehemence of their battle. So Nicholas, my basic view is there are too many people on the left who help the right build up wokery, but I don't think wokery is objectively nearly as big a problem as many on the right say it is.
Okay, great. Let's go to Louise Tarrant. So we've got a question from Australia. Go ahead, Louise. Hello, hello.
Hi, thanks, Peter. I guess my question, well, I guess the absence in this conversation that I think is interesting is any reference to climate change, because surely it's got to be the critical intervention that's the unknown. In Australia at the moment, there's a debate playing out. There's sort of an increasing view amongst scientists that we're no way going to meet the 1.5 degrees aspiration of Paris. It's likely to be well beyond that, and the climate impacts are going to be pretty devastating. And that seems to me to invite potentially greater government intervention to try and assist and get markets working towards solutions. But on the other hand, also state repression as crises come after crises and governments, I think, you know, become more unstable. So I'm just curious as to where that factors into the sort of scenarios that you're painting.
Louise, yeah, look, thank you for raising that. You're absolutely right. I should have raised it, actually myself. And going back to one of Nicholas's questions, you know, if politics is going to take a new direction, what it does about climate change will be part of that. For my mind, in terms of historic policy terms, the most important consequence of Joe Biden's election is what he's now doing and proposing on climate change. The fact he's appointed John Kerry as his sort of climate change, what is it, SAR representative cabinet member. I know John Kerry a little bit, and my God, he's the right choice for that, because when he gets he's passionate about climate change, and B, when he gets his bit between the teeth, as he did when he was Secretary of State, he makes things happen. So I'm much more optimistic now Trump is out of office and Joe Biden's there, and I think things might happen. And I think John Kerry is either now or in the next day or two will be in Beijing, I think, and that is going to be critical because there's a real problem in relations with China. How do we work with China on things like climate change, where China's cooperation is essential, while at the same time having rightly a tough stance on China's human rights record over Hong Kong, over the Uyghurs, and so on. Typical stuff. But the thing that strikes me, and again, this is where I think Joe Biden's victory is so important, is that the one part of the green agenda in terms of capital G, green parties in Europe, is over the last 30 or 40 years, they seem to have been about stopping people doing things, stopping using their cars, stopping flying, stopping eating meat or curbing. And there may be some, I'm sure we will have to change our living styles in some ways, but the way climate change is going to be solved, in my view, principally, is through market measures and through technology and through invention and through a fiscal system like carbon pricing that creates strong incentives to invent and apply clean energy policies. I think there's certainly in Europe, and here's where I think there's an opening, if you like, for the traditional left to steal a march from the Greens by offering a much broader climate change agenda, which includes the role of markets and technology and incentives. And it's not simply about saying you can no longer do this, which is what the Green parties have been saying.
Peter, there we have to bring it to a close. It's been a really, really good discussion. We could talk about many of these things for a lot more time to come. I want to pick your brains about opinion polls in Scotland, but I don't think we've got time for that here now either. It's been really good. Thank you so much. It's been a really good conversation.
Pleasure. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you.